Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming this evening to what is now our fourth Remembrance event. So welcome to Trinity, Southport. So lovely to see you all. Tonight's event is really, it's not a history lesson, it's more a lesson from history. And our theme, as you're aware, is the children at war. And I have to apologize because some of the sound archives and the recordings are now very old, 70, 80 years old. So the quality is not the greatest. It's not like a modern sound recording. So bear with us. I would ask you, please turn off your cell phones because this is really a show that involves sound and light. We're so used to looking at our phones, our laptops, our TVs, cinema, and you're visually bombarded. Tonight, I would like you just to almost close your eyes and listen to the sound effects, to the readings. And it's very much like in the old days, they listened to the radio, what my mother would call the wireless. And you're using your imagination. You're putting yourself into a period back in time that didn't actually have TVs and phones and laptops. After the event is over, you're all welcome to go into the church hall for a reception. And it's a fairly short performance. It's about 45, 50 minutes. So with that being said, let's start. Thanks, Rosie. Under the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child, persons under the age of 18 are defined as children. Children are easy prey for military recruitment. Some are recruited by force, while others choose to join up, often to escape poverty or because they expect military life to offer an adventurous passage into adulthood. The youngest known soldier of World War I was Momcilo Gavrić, who joined the 6th Artillery Division of the Serbian Army at the age of 8, after Austro-Hungarian troops in August 1914 killed his parents, his grandmother, and 7 of his siblings. My great-grandfather, Admiral Sir Percy Scott, lost his eldest son, John, at the infamous naval battle in World War I of Jutland. He was a Royal Navy midshipman officer on active service. He was 16 years old. 2 years earlier, in 1914, in a speech to the House of Commons, Winston Churchill, the then First Lord of the Admiralty, said, "The decision to send the naval cadets from Dartmouth Royal Naval College to sea in time of war was arrived at considerable time ago. It was felt that young officers of their age would be of great use on board His Majesty's ships, and they would learn incomparably more of their profession in war than any educational establishment on shore could teach them."
The Hitler Youth movement is perhaps one of the more chilling facets of the Nazi regime. To quote from Adolf Hitler in the 1933 Nuremberg Rally, "I begin with the young. We older ones are used up, but my magnificent youngsters, look at these men and boys. What material! With them, I can create a new world." In January of 1933, there were 50,000 members of the Hitler Youth. By the end of that year, there were more than 2 million. And in 1936, they banned all youth groups, including the Boy Scouts, and forced members to become part of the Hitler Youth instead. Jewish children were, of course, banned from participation. As Germany hurtled toward war, children who refused to join were alienated, then punished. By 1939, over 90% of German children were part of the Hitler Youth organization. For the Nazis, the group had other benefits. Not only did it allow the Third Reich to indoctrinate children at their most impressionable, but it let the Nazis remove them from the influence of their parents, some of whom opposed the regime. The Hitler Youth was a way to get Hitler's ideology into the family unit, and some members of the Hitler Youth even denounced their parents when they behaved in ways not approved of by the Reich.
As with many German children, the Hitler Youth became the single most important influence in Henry's life. His group met after school and all day Saturday. Plenty of sport, with the emphasis on teamwork. And training in useful skills. Signaling, fixing bikes, collecting waste and scrap metal. But the most important lesson was in Nazi theory. Learning to love Hitler.
It was as if we had created our own atmosphere, the atmosphere of the young, the coming German generation. After all, as the Führer had written, Germany's future belonged to its youth. I told Father that. He replied somewhat crushingly,
"That's like saying the grass is green."
As his father knew, Henry was being indoctrinated, his head filled with propaganda, Nazi lies, or half-truths endlessly repeated. For adults, spotting propaganda was hard enough. For the young, it was almost impossible.
I remember one day I came home from school and said to my mother,
"You know, Mama, I don't think it's right that Dr. Bergman touches me anymore."
Dr. Bergman was our family doctor. Of course, straight away, my mother jumped to the wrong conclusion.
What did he do? Oh, no. He treated me well. He's a very kind man. Well, what then? It's just... I don't think it's right. The German boy should be touched by a Jew.
She was horrified that I should say such a stupid, wicked thing. In my defense, I explained how that very day a man in a brown uniform had told our class in school how we should keep the race pure, and how he'd been very proud of me because I had said, "I know, why don't we throw all the Jews out of Germany?" Like this was some brilliant solution to Germany's problems. But my mother wasn't impressed. All she wanted to know was...
Dr. Bergman, did you mention Dr. Bergman to this man that he touched you? Yes, Mama. But I did say I didn't think Dr. Bergman was a bad man. Oh my God.
Oh my God. That's all she said.
In the summer of 1940, faced with the threat of Nazi German invasion, the British government conceived a plan to evacuate children to overseas countries.
They're happy where they are. The children are safer in the country. Leave them there. And let's all be grateful to those who will give them a Merry Christmas. Remember, they're happy where they are.
This is the story of Beryl Myatt, a child evacuee during the Second World War. The British government evacuated thousands of children to safety in Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. In wartime, however, these long voyages were hazardous. German submarines, U-boats, patrolled the shipping lanes from Britain into the Atlantic Ocean, preying on merchant ships in an attempt to strangle Britain's lifeline of vital imports. In September of 1940, 9-year-old Beryl Myatt was living at home in Hillingdon, outside of London. On the 9th of September, a letter arrived for her father. It contained instructions for Beryl's evacuation via the passenger ship called the City of Benares, which would transport her from London to the safety of her aunt and uncle in Canada. As it was thought that the risk of U-boat attack was greatest in the first few days at sea, the passengers aboard the City of Benares held regular lifeboat drills and were instructed to even sleep in their life jackets. With such bad weather, many of the children were seasick. On the 17th of September, the City of Benares was 250 miles west of the Scottish coast and was thought to be out of the most dangerous zone. But later that day, the ship was spotted by Heinrich Blackrod, captain of the German submarine U-48. That night, Blackrod fired a torpedo that penetrated the ship's hull and exploded, filling the ship with the acrid smell of explosives. British Captain L. Nicholl gave the order to abandon ship. Children, escorts, and other passengers started boarding their lifeboats, a process hampered by the bad weather and the ship's loss of power. At around 11 p.m., the City of Benares sank, its bow rising from the sea and disappearing into the rough Atlantic Ocean, with its emergency lights still blazing. 24 hours later, the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Hurricane arrived on the scene of the sinking, having picked up a distress call. HMS Hurricane picked up 105 survivors, both in lifeboats and clinging to rafts. 51 passengers and 122 crew members of the City of Benares were completely lost. Of the 90 children who had been aboard, 77 died in the sinking. Among the dead was Beryl Myatt. The news of the sinking took some days to reach the families of those lost at sea. Unaware of her death, Beryl's parents, Tom and Emmy, wrote to her on the 21st of September, saying, "We expect that you enjoyed your voyage on the boat across the wide Atlantic Ocean," and reminding her to be a good girl for her aunt and uncle. Her parents marked the letter with the muddy paw print of her family dog, Chummy, and signed the letter with tons of love and heaps of kisses. God bless you, Mummy and Daddy. But the British propaganda machine painted quite a different story.
Victims of Hitler's attempt to drown innocent children, the 320 evacuees who were torpedoed by a bestial U-boat commander all land back safely at a British port. Far from being scared by their experience, any one of these kiddies has got more courage than a dozen Nazi baby killers. They've got the right spirit, and they all want to be off again. As one of them said, "Mother may want to stop me, but I'll write to her and she'll understand."
World War II began in September of 1939. There were approximately 1.6 million Jewish children living in the territories that the German armies or their allies would occupy. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, more than 1 million, and perhaps as many as 1.5 million, Jewish children were dead, targeted victims in the Nazis' calculated program of genocide. As Warsaw ghetto historian Emanuel Richtenblum wrote in 1942, "Even in the most barbaric times, a human spark glowed in the rudest heart, and children were spared. But the Hitlerian beast is quite different. It would devour the dearest of us, those who arouse the greatest compassion, our innocent children."
They're the faces of some of the youngest victims of the Holocaust, Jewish children who escaped a near certain death at the hands of the Nazis. They're pictures taken by relief agencies after World War II.
This 16-year-old girl watched her two brothers and her aunt cremated. She has lost her father and mother.
In 1945, the BBC turned to the radio, hoping to reunite children with lost family. Some 66 years later, their photos are now turning up on the internet. They're part of an online program by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum called Remember Me. It tells the story of the Holocaust through a child's eyes.
I've always understood that these people were just kids when this happened, but seeing the child first, I think, makes that understanding on a much deeper level than just an intellectual level.
One of those children is Nathan Kranowski. He's the son of Jewish immigrants from Poland and was living in Paris when the war started.
I'm afraid I have just about no memory of either of my parents.
Nathan's father was arrested in 1941. A year later, the same fate fell to his mother. At 4 years old, Nathan was now an orphan. His aunt placed him in hiding with a Catholic couple.
In those days, only Jews would have the name Nathan. I was called Pierre.
Nathan says he remembers very little from the war, except for one day when he came face to face with a couple of German soldiers.
What I do remember is the dog they had with them. He was probably bigger on 4 feet than I was on 2. And that dog frightened me. I remember the dog. I think it was a German Shepherd.
Nathan moved to the U.S. after the war, eventually becoming a professor of French. He never knew what happened to his parents. The answer he found many years later in a book that followed Jews from France during the war.
It was like seeing a tombstone for the first time. That was the effect it had on me.
Nathan's father was sent on Convoy 7 to Auschwitz. He was gassed upon arrival. His mother was on Convoy number 12 to Auschwitz, also killed upon arrival.
It was a very emotional moment. It was the closest I could come today to some connection with my father, and then again with my mother, whose name I also saw in that book.
Now in his 70s, Nathan still considers himself a survivor. And it's stories like his, along with countless others, the museum is hoping to tell by asking the basic question, Remember Me. Nicole Grether, The Associated Press.
All Jews were targeted for death, but the mortality rate for children was especially high. Only 6 to 11% of Europe's pre-war Jewish population of children survived, as compared to 33% of the adults. The young generally were not selected for forced labor, and the Nazis often carried out children's actions to reduce the number of useless eaters in the ghettos. In the camps, children, the elderly, and pregnant women routinely were sent to the gas chambers immediately after arrival. This is George Dalton, 17 years on, after the liberation by U.S. soldiers.
I ran in that direction, and as I came onto that place, I noticed many prisoners yelling and screaming and jumping and dancing, and there, standing among them, were 7 giants, young people. They must have been 18 or 19 American soldiers. There were 7 or 8 of them standing inside the camp. Apparently they cut the wire and came into the camp. They were bewildered by us, wild and unkempt and dirty and I'm sure smelly people, jumping and dancing and trying to embrace them and kiss them. And I did too. I also joined the crowd and yelled and screamed, and somehow knew that the day of liberation has come. It was a strange feeling for me, however, because as I remembered, on the one hand, I was overwhelmed by this unexpected and unhoped for encounter of freedom, but at the same time, what was happening was outside of me. I didn't know what to make of it. I knew I was free, but I didn't count on it. I somehow didn't know what it meant, and I knew it was great, but I was overjoyed because all people around me were overjoyed and were singing and dancing, but I was 17. I was free, but what it meant, I wasn't sure.
Calvin Graham was just 11 years old and in the 6th grade in Crockett, Texas, when he hatched his plan to lie about his age and join the Navy. Calvin was one of 7 children living at home with an abusive stepfather. At 5'2" and just 125 pounds, Graham dressed in an older brother's clothes and fedora and practiced talking deep. What worried him most was not that an enlistment officer would spot the forged signature. It was the dentist who would peer into the mouths of potential recruits.
I knew he'd know how young I was by my teeth. Finally, the dentist said he didn't have time to mess with me, and he let me go. The Navy knew that me and the others on line that day were underage, but we were losing the war then, so they took 6 of us.
It wasn't uncommon for boys to lie about their age in order to serve. Ray Jackson, who joined the Marines at 16 during World War II, founded the groups Veterans of Underage Military Service in 1991, and it listed more than 1,200 active members, including 26 women.
Some of these guys came from large families, and there wasn't enough food to go around, and this was a way out. Others just had family problems and wanted to get away.
Calvin Graham told his mother he was going to visit relatives. Instead, he dropped out of the 7th grade and shipped off to San Diego for basic training.
There, the drill instructors were aware of the underage recruits and often made us run extra miles and lug heavier packs.
Seaman Graham, now serving aboard U.S. South Dakota, became a teenager turning 13 on November 6, 1942, just as Japanese naval forces began shelling an American airfield on Guadalcanal Island.
General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations.
One Japanese ship set its searchlights on the South Dakota, and the ship took 42 enemy hits, temporarily losing power. Graham was manning his gun when shrapnel tore through his jaw and mouth. Another hit him down, and he fell through 3 stories of superstructure. Still, the 13-year-old made it to his feet, dazed, bleeding, and helped pull crew members to safety, while others were thrown by the force of the explosions, their bodies aflame, into the Pacific.
I took belts off the dead and made tourniquets for the living, and gave them cigarettes and encouraged them all night. It was a long night. It aged me. The shrapnel had knocked out my front teeth, and I had flash burns from the hot guns. But I was fixed up with salve and a couple of stitches. I didn't do any complaining, as half the ship was dead. It was a while before they worked on my mouth.
Calvin Graham received a Bronze Star for distinguishing himself in combat, as well as a Purple Heart for his injuries. Graham's mother reported having recognized her son in a newsreel footage, wrote the Navy, revealing the gunner's true age. Graham returned to Texas and was thrown in a brig at Corpus Christi for almost 3 months. Graham, meanwhile, managed to get a message out to his sister Pearl, who complained to the newspapers that the Navy was mistreating the baby vet. The Navy eventually ordered Graham's release, but not before stripping him of his medals for lying about his age and revoking his disability benefits. He was simply tossed from jail with a suit and a few dollars in his pocket and no honorable discharge. At age 13, Graham tried to return to school, but he couldn't keep pace with students his age and quickly dropped out. He married at age 14, became a father the following year, and found work as a welder in the Houston shipyard. Neither his job nor his marriage lasted long. At 17 years old and divorced, and with no service record, Graham was about to be drafted when he enlisted in the Marine Corps. He soon broke his back in a fall, for which he received a 20% service-connected disability. The only work he could find after that was selling magazine subscriptions. At the age of 12, Calvin Graham broke the law to serve his country at a time when the U.S. military might well be accused of having had a don't ask, don't tell policy with regard to underage enlistees. For fear of losing their benefits or their honorable discharges, Many baby vets never came forward to claim the nation's gratitude. It wasn't until 1994, 2 years after he died, that the military relented and returned the seaman's last medal, his Purple Heart, to his family.
As the youngest hero of the French resistance, Marcel Pant was just 6 years old. His father, Eugene Pant, alias Athos, was a resistance leader who ran a network from the remote family farmhouse in La Goberti, a hamlet in the Aix-sur-Vienne area. His 6-year-old son Marcel was a liaison agent who carried secret messages and letters to surrounding farms. With his school satchel on his back, he didn't raise any suspicions. Marcel surprised people with his astonishing memory, and he was trusted to deliver messages even to the resistance chiefs, which he hid under his shirt. Marcel was happy to spend time in the woods with resistance fighters, known as maquisards, when he learned about their clandestine methods. Eugene, his wife Paul, and their 5 children would also host secret farmhouse meetings with the resistance fighters, and they even hid a British paratrooper in their loft. Marcel's grandmother described him as extremely happy, intelligent, and sparkling with mischief. Marcel was eager to play his part in the struggle against Nazi Germany, and he became an agent nicknamed Quinquin, or Little Kid. In August of 1944, the boy who carried messages for the resistance died, tragically, when one of the guerrillas' Sten guns went off by accident. He was honored on Armistice Day at the ceremony in Aix-sur-Vienne, near the city of Limoges in central France. Marcel's role was eventually recognized by the French state, and in 1950, he was posthumously awarded the rank of Sergeant of the Resistance.
Ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal. Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien. C'est payé. Allumer le feu, mes chagrins, mes plaisirs, je n'ai plus besoin de balayer les amours avec leur trémolo, balayer pour toujours, je repars à zéro. Non, rien de rien. Je ne regrette rien, ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal.
The youngest child recorded on active combat duty in World War II was Sergei Aleshkov. Sergei lived in the village of Grin in the remote Kalgua region in Russia. The village was a recognized resistance stronghold against the Nazis. For their complicity, the villagers were executed ruthlessly by advancing Germans. The 10-year-old brother of Sergei, named Petya, was hanged. And his mother was shot while trying to protect her son. Thanks to a neighbor, Sergei escaped through a window and ran into the forest. Sergei was left an orphan at 6 years old and was forced to run for his life from the German soldiers, who destroyed the village and anything living within it. Sergei wandered and hid in the forest for 2 weeks. On September the 8th, 1942, he was found, barely alive, by Russian soldiers from the 142nd Regiment. Sergei was, by that time, physically and psychologically exhausted, and his body was full of scabs from insect bites. On the basis that Sergei had a greater chance of survival with the regiment that had shelter, food, and clothing, the regimental commander enlisted Sergei as an active and uniformed soldier. 2 months later, Sergei Aleshkov was wounded at the infamous Battle of Stalingrad. After recovery in the field hospital, Sergei returned to active duty. In April 1943, he received a combat medal for saving the life of his regimental commander, who had been buried in an explosion. Sergei remained with his regiment until the end of the war in 1945. He was then entered into the Suvorov Military School, still only 9 years old.
Сквозь штормы бури, через все преграды, ты, песня Ладоги, лети. Дорога здесь пробита сквозь блокаду, родни дороги не найти. Эх, Ладога, родная Ладога, метели, штормы, грозная волна. Недаром Ладога родная дорогой жизни названа. Пусть ветер Ладоги поведает народу, как летом баржу за баржой грузили мы и в шторм, и в непогоду, забыв про отдых и покой. Зимой машины мчались вереницы, и лед на Ладоге трещал. Возили хлеб для северной столицы, и радостно нас Ленинград встречал. И знаем мы, кровавая блокада исчезнет скоро, словно тень. Растут и крепнут силы Ленинграда, растут и крепнут каждый день.
As we think about the loss of innocence, the loss of time to play, the loss of childhood, please pray with me. O Lord, you show us how to love. While he was still an infant, your son, Jesus, became a refugee. Help us to come closer to him by becoming closer to the children who are victims of war and violence, by becoming closer to those separated from adults who would protect them, to those who are refugees or evacuees of war, to those minors forced to take up weapons, to those forced to flee their homes because of war. Clear our eyes that we may see the suffering of children. Open our ears that we may hear the cries of those deep in despair. Release our feet that we may walk in greater solidarity with children who suffer the injustices of war. And free our hands from wanting to grab more so that we may share more generously with those who have lost everything. Unloose our tongues that we might speak your words of hope, peace, and love to children and provide safe space for their healing and growth. Widen our minds to think of new ways to provide help and protection to children who are vulnerable. Give us open hearts that we may be truly hospitable to others, that we may be people of peace. Lord, grant us greater courage to pray, learn, and act in support of children everywhere. May your mercy be known in all that we say and do. Lord, may your mercy shine in us. Amen. And may I invite you now to please stand as able with me for 2 minutes of silence.
It is estimated that over 13 million children died in World War II, either in concentration camps, civilian casualties, or in combat. Today, we ask ourselves if the world has learned from history. Has the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child made any progress? A recent UN report verified that 8,500 children were used as soldiers last year in 2020, while another 2,700 children were killed and another 6,000 injured in various conflicts. According to some estimates, up to 40% of child soldiers are in Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo has amongst the highest numbers of child soldiers in Africa and the world. While there is no precise data, thousands of boys and girls have been actively recruited or conscripted, accounting for up to 60% of militia forces. Known locally as Kadegos, a Swahili term meaning little ones, child soldiers have been used by all sides throughout the decades of conflict in the region. This Veterans Day, we remember and honor those children trapped in the horrors of war, not for them the limelight of heroes, just an innocent childhood that was stolen from them and subsequently forgotten.
In the streets, 2 lunches of sweets, spitfires in the air, castles to wear, U-boats in the sea, spam fritters for tea, a battle of wits, survive the blitz, Churchill and the wireless, brutalities and swears, our country needs us, 'cause it's not over yet. Mom's working the land, Glenn Miller's big band, let's meet to amend, when Miller's end, Dad's off to the war, who knows what's instead, when you're a kid in World War II. Trains wait at the station, we're going away, an evacuation to a safe place to stay. Searchlights on the planes sing the